She was on her knees in the dirt, not praying, not begging, just trying to pick up what had spilled, what always seemed to spill when her hands were the ones holding it. And the whole town stood there watching. Not one person moved, not one hand reached down. Only mouths, only words sharp enough to cut through the cold Colorado morning like a blade through thin cloth. And then boots, heavy, deliberate boots. A man knelt beside her, and the world held its breath. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had a rule she lived by. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. Keep moving. It wasn't a rule anyone had written for her. Nobody sat her down and explained it. But 25 years of living in Red Hollow, Colorado, had carved that rule into her bones, the same way frost cracks stone slowly, quietly, until the damage goes all the way through. She woke up before the sun most mornings. Not because anyone asked her to, because the work didn't wait, and Clara had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive in a town that didn't want you was to make yourself so useful they couldn't justify throwing you out. She cleaned homes. She repaired clothes, mended tears so fine that the women who wore those dresses never gave a second thought to who had saved them. She helped families during harvest season, carrying, sorting, hauling, until her shoulders burned and her hands cracked open from the cold. And when she collected her small pay at the end of the day, she thanked them. Even when they didn't thank her. Even when they didn't look at her. That was the rule. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. Keep moving. She had no family left to speak of. Her mother died of fever when Clara was 14. Her father, a good man tired and broken by years of failed crops and borrowed money, followed 2 winters later. They left her nothing but a small wooden trunk, a Bible with the cover worn soft as skin, and the understanding that the world was not a place that made room for people like her. She wasn't bitter about it. Or if she was, she had packed that bitterness so deep inside herself that she could no longer find the seams. What she had instead was quiet, and practicality, and the strange, stubborn habit of noticing when other people needed help, even when no one noticed her. The morning it happened started like every other morning. Cold, gray. The kind of Colorado cold that doesn't announce itself, it just settles into the air like it owns the place, which in November it does. Clara had been hired that week by old Mrs. Hatcher, who lived 3 streets over from the supply store and could no longer carry her own groceries without her knees threatening to give out beneath her. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It never was. Someone mentioned Clara's name. Someone else said she worked cheap and didn't complain, and that was how most of her jobs began. She had loaded a wooden basket with Mrs. Hatcher's supplies: flour, salt pork, a small tin of coffee, 2 yards of plain cotton cloth, and was carrying it back from the store when the edge of the boardwalk caught her boot. Later, she would think about that moment. Just the boardwalk edge. Just a single loose plank that had been loose for 3 seasons and that nobody had bothered to fix because nobody important walked that particular stretch. She went down on one knee. The basket tilted. And everything. Every carefully chosen, carefully packed item spilled out into the street. The flour bag split open on impact. The tin of coffee rolled into a puddle. The cotton cloth unfurled across the mud. Clara didn't make a sound. She never did, not when she hurt herself. She just pressed her lips together, steadied her breathing, and started reaching for the closest things first. The way you do when you've practiced getting back up so many times that the motions become automatic. That was when the shadow fell over her. She looked up. Eleanor Whitfield stood on the boardwalk above her, wrapped in a coat that cost more than Clara made in a month, with 2 women flanking her, the way decorative columns flank a door. Eleanor's husband owned the largest dry goods operation in 3 counties. Eleanor herself owned the reputation of being the most influential woman in Red Hollow, which was a reputation she maintained the way some people maintain a garden, with constant vigilance and a willingness to cut anything that grew too close. Well, Eleanor said, not moving an inch to help. I suppose this is what happens when you ask someone to do a job they're not equipped to manage. Clara kept her eyes on the spilled goods. I just need a moment, she said quietly. You need more than a moment, Eleanor replied. You've made a mess of public property and now everyone has to walk around you." It wasn't true. The street was wide enough for 3 wagons to pass. But truth in Eleanor Whitfield's hands had always been more of a suggestion than a principle. "I'll have it cleaned up shortly," Clara said. She reached for the flour bag, squeezing the torn edges together, trying to save what she could. There wasn't much. The flour had already soaked into the frozen mud, turning gray and useless. That was nearly a week's wages ruined. She didn't let herself think about that yet. Later. She'd think about it later. "You know," Eleanor said loud enough for the people who had begun to gather to hear every word. "Some people spend their whole lives taking up space without ever becoming valuable." The words landed the way Eleanor intended them to land. Clara felt it in her chest. Not a wound exactly, because wounds were sharp and sudden. This was more like pressure, like a hand pushing down on a bruise that had never fully healed. She heard murmuring around her. Not protest, not sympathy. Just the quiet, satisfied sound of a crowd that has found something to watch. She kept her eyes down. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. Keep moving. That was the rule. She was reaching for the cotton cloth when she heard it. A different sound cutting through the quiet. The steady, unhurried rhythm of a horse's hooves on packed earth, slowing, then stopping. And then boots. Not the polished, thin-soled boots of a man trying to look important. These were working boots, heavy leather worn at the toe from real use, the kind worn by someone who spent most of his life on his feet rather than showing them off. They stopped right beside her. A man knelt down into the mud beside her without a word. Large hands, rough with calluses, reached for the coffee tin before she could, and then for a corner of the cotton cloth, and he began folding it with the careful, matter-of-fact movements of someone who had no particular interest in being seen doing a kindness. He was simply doing it. Clara was so startled she forgot for a full 3 seconds to keep her head down. She looked at him. How was tall, even kneeling. Dark hat pulled low. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. Eyes that were a steady, unreadable gray, not cold, but careful. The kind of eyes that had spent a long time learning to look at things slowly before forming any opinion. She knew who he was. Everybody in Red Hollow knew Caleb Walker. He owned the Walker Ranch, 800 acres of prime Colorado rangeland, cattle horses, and enough reputation that men who did business with him called him Mr. Walker and meant it. He was 30, maybe 32. He had never married. He kept largely to himself. He came into town for supplies, conducted his business efficiently, spoke to people briefly and politely, and left. I was not by any measure a man who knelt in public streets to help women that Red Hollow considered beneath notice. And yet, there he was. Clara realized she was staring. She looked away quickly and reached for the split flour bag. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. "I'm choosing to." He picked up the last corner of the cloth, looked it over once, and placed it in the basket, as though none of this were remarkable. As though this were simply the natural order of things, a man helping a woman who needed help. He looked at the flour bag in her hands. "That's finished," he said plainly. "You won't get much back from that. I know." She could feel the color rising in her face, not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sharp, helpless frustration of losing something she couldn't afford to lose. I'll figure it out." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stood, and she thought he was going to walk away, that the act of charity was complete, and now the natural order would resume. Instead, he looked up at Eleanor Whitfield. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Kindness," he said, "isn't something only wealthy people deserve." The boardwalk went quiet in a way that felt different from before. Before, the quiet had been comfortable for the people standing in it. This quiet was not comfortable. This quiet had edges. Eleanor's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Surprise, then displeasure. Then the kind of controlled composure that wealthy women in small towns practice until it becomes reflex. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I didn't realize you had an interest in—" "I don't have an interest in scenes," he said simply. "I have an interest in fairness." He reached into his coat and produced a few coins which he set on the edge of the basket without ceremony. "For the flower," he said to Clara. She shook her head. "I couldn't." "I'm not asking," he said, not unkindly, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to discuss it further. "Someone helped me once when I didn't think I deserved it. I'm passing it forward, that's all." He stood up, fully touched the brim of his hat to Clara, not to Eleanor, and walked back to his horse. The crowd watched him mount and ride away. And then slowly they began looking at Clara again. But the look had changed. It wasn't much. It wasn't acceptance or warmth or even respect. But it wasn't the comfortable, entitled dismissal. It had been 3 minutes ago either. There was uncertainty in it. The kind of uncertainty that comes when the person who sets the temperature in a room has been publicly, quietly, and entirely calmly overruled. Clara gathered what remained of the supplies. She picked up the basket. She walked away. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. Keep moving. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked with her shoulders slightly straighter than before. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She almost believed it. 3 days passed. Clara went back to work. She finished Mrs. Hatcher's week. She took on a mending job for the Pendleton family. She did not think about Caleb Walker or about the way he had knelt beside her in the dirt, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, or about the weight of those 3 words, "I'm choosing to," which had a habit of surfacing in her mind at inconvenient moments. She also, if she was honest with herself, thought about almost nothing else. On the 4th day, she was walking home from the Pendleton house in the early afternoon when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. Steady, unhurried. She kept walking. "Miss Whitmore?" She stopped. She turned around. Caleb Walker stood a respectful distance back, hat in hand, this time, which she found she hadn't expected. He looked slightly different without the shadow of the brim across his face, younger maybe, or simply more human. "I was hoping to speak with you," he said. Clara glanced around instinctively, the old habit of checking to see who was watching, what the watching would cost her. "What about?" she asked. "Work," he said. "Honest work for fair pay. I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it." She studied him. She had grown up in a town where propositions were rarely as simple as they sounded. She had learned to look for the thing behind the thing, the favor inside the favor, the debt waiting inside the gift. "I'm listening," she said. Careful, non-committal. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Dunmore, has been with me for 12 years, Caleb said. "She's 71. Her hands have gotten bad arthritis. She can't manage everything alone anymore." He paused. "I need someone to help run the household. Cooking, managing supplies, keeping things organized. It's real work, not light work. But the pay is fair and the hours are set." Clara waited. "That's the proposition?" she asked. "That's all of it." She turned the offer over in her mind, looking for the catch, the hidden clause, the thing she would owe him later that hadn't been mentioned yet. "Why me?" she asked directly. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "Because," he said, "when everyone else walked away, you stopped to help." She frowned. "You mean Mrs. Hatcher?" "Yes. That was just—" She paused. "She needed help." "I know," he said. "That's my point." "So," she said she would think about it. She went home to her small rented room above the harness maker's shop, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about it until the light faded and she had to light the lamp. The practical arguments were obvious. The pay he'd named was almost double what she made pieceworking across 3 households. Regular hours meant she could plan. A fixed position meant stability, something she hadn't had since her parents died. But there was more to it than practicality. The part she kept circling back to, the part she was most suspicious of, because suspicion had always been her most reliable protection, was the memory of him kneeling beside her. The uncomplicated decency of it. The way he hadn't looked for an audience. Nobody in Red Hollow did anything without looking for an audience. That was what made her distrust it. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling until she fell asleep, And when she woke up in the gray pre-dawn with the sound of the harness maker already moving around below her, she had made her decision. She would go. Not because she trusted it completely, but because she had spent her entire life choosing safety, choosing the thing that cost her nothing. And it had brought her to a place where she was crying over a ruined flour bag in a cold street while a crowd watched. She was 25 years old. She thought it might be time to choose something different. Walker Ranch was larger than she had imagined. Not in a showy way, nothing about it announced itself. But the scale of it was unmistakable. The land rolled out in every direction, broken by fence lines and bare winter trees, and the distant shapes of cattle moving slowly through the cold. There were Barnes work buildings, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. And at the center, a main house that was solidly built and clearly lived in, not decorated to impress visitors, but maintained by someone who genuinely cared about the place. Mrs. Dunmore met her at the door. She was a small round woman with bright black eyes and hands so swollen with arthritis that they looked like they belonged to someone twice her size. She moved carefully, precisely compensating for the pain with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing it for years. She looked Clara over with those bright eyes and said without preamble, "You're smaller than I expected." "I make up for it," Clara said. Mrs. Dunmore's mouth curved. "Caleb said you were practical." She stepped back from the door. "Come in then. I'll show you where everything is." The first week was a revelation. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. That was in itself remarkable. She was thanked. For ordinary things. For completing ordinary tasks. Caleb Walker thanked her for preparing a meal, thanked her for having supplies organized when he needed them. Thanked her once carefully, as though he understood it might be an unusual thing to say, for noticing that one of the ranch hands had been riding with an injured shoulder and alerting him before it became a serious problem. "How did you notice that?" he asked. "I was favoring his left side when he carried his saddle," Clara said. "He was trying not to show it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't look that closely." "I've spent a long time looking at people who don't look back," Clara said before she could decide not to. She expected the words to land awkwardly. Instead, he looked at her with that slow, careful gaze of his and said, "I imagine that makes you very good at understanding people." She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to what she was doing and tried not to think about it. But she thought about it. He asked her opinions. That was the second unusual thing. Not opinions about household matters that would have been natural enough. He asked what she thought about the price of winter feed, and whether she had noticed any changes in the weather patterns, and what she made of a dispute one of his ranch hands had mentioned with a neighboring property. At first, she answered briefly, feeling for the familiar shape of a conversation where she said too much and was reminded of her place. The reminder never came. He listened. He responded as though her opinion had weight. And then sometimes he disagreed quietly, directly, and explained his reasoning and waited for her to respond to that. She had never had a conversation like that with a man. She hadn't had many conversations like that at all. After 2 weeks, she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Not entirely old habits don't die cleanly. But she stopped bracing quite so hard every time she opened her mouth. She laughed once, unexpectedly, at something Mrs. Dunmore said at breakfast. A real laugh that came from somewhere she hadn't visited in a long time. She noticed Caleb look up from across the kitchen. He didn't say anything. But something in his expression had shifted, and she caught herself noticing that before she could stop herself. The town noticed. She had expected that. She had not quite expected how quickly it moved. By the end of the third week, she overheard 2 women talking in the dry goods store. They didn't lower their voices when she walked in, which told her they either didn't see her or more likely didn't particularly care if she heard. "She latched onto him is what I heard," the first woman said. "You know how those people are, they find someone with money and they make themselves indispensable." "Poor Caleb," the second said. "He's too kind-hearted for his own good. She'll take advantage of that." Clara stood very still. She was holding a paper of sewing needles. She set it down carefully on the counter. She left the store without buying anything. She walked back toward the ranch at a pace that was just slightly faster than usual, and she kept her jaw set because if she let it loosen, she wasn't entirely sure what might happen. The words did what words had always done. They found the parts of her that still believed them. Indispensable. As though her value could only be strategic. As though there was no version of Clara Whitmore who belonged somewhere simply because she worked hard and was good at what she did. As though the only explanation for a man treating her with dignity was that she had somehow tricked him into it. That evening she sat outside the kitchen door after supper. The cold air felt honest in a way the inside of her head didn't. She heard footsteps and didn't move. "You're quiet tonight," Caleb said, sitting down on the step beside her. Not too close, not demanding anything. Just there. She didn't answer immediately. "Do you believe what people say about me?" she asked. He looked at her, and she could feel the quality of his attention, the kind that doesn't rush. "Which people?" he said. "Any of them." "Not particularly," he said. "Why?" She pressed her lips together. "They say I'm here for your money. That I'm playing at being something I'm not." There was a silence. "Are you?" he asked. She looked at him sharply. "No." "Then I don't know why what they say matters." "Because—" She stopped herself. Tried again. "Because I spent most of my life hearing things like that, and eventually you start wondering if—" She stared at the dark stretch of the ranch yard. "You start wondering if they're seeing something about you that you can't see yourself." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "You know what I've watched you do in 3 weeks?" She didn't respond. "You rearranged the supply system, so we're not double ordering and running out of the same things at the same time. You noticed Henderson's shoulder when I didn't. You sat with Mrs. Dunmore for 2 hours last Tuesday when her hands hurt too badly to do anything useful, and you didn't make her feel bad about it. You cook a meal that actually tastes like something." He paused. "You do all of it without asking to be noticed for it." Clara swallowed. "That's just work," she said. "No," he said. "That's character." He wasn't looking at her the way men usually looked at women in Red Hollow as possessions to be assessed, or problems to be avoided, or charity cases to be managed. He was looking at her the way he looked at a fence line that needed fixing, or a horse that was favoring its leg, with the straightforward attention of a man who took the things in front of him seriously. She didn't have a response for that, not a real one. So she just nodded once, and they sat together in the cold dark without speaking, and that was somehow better than anything she could have said. By the end of the month, Clara Whitmore had done something she hadn't done in years. She had stopped apologizing for being in the room. It happened gradually. So gradually that she might not have noticed it herself if Mrs. Dunmore hadn't pointed it out one morning direct as a hammer. "You're standing up straighter," the old woman said, not looking up from her mending. Clara paused in the middle of organizing the pantry shelves. "Am I? Started 3 days ago." Mrs. Dunmore glanced up with those bright black eyes. "Don't stop. It suits you." Clara turned back to the shelf. She was smiling. She couldn't have said exactly when the ranch had stopped feeling temporary, when it had shifted from a place she was borrowing to a place where she might belong. It wasn't a moment. It was 100 small moments, stacked one on top of another, like stones in a steady wall. But something else was building too. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Something she was fairly sure she shouldn't name. Because Caleb Walker was her employer. And she was a woman with no property, no family name, and a history in this town that people would always use against her. And she was practical. She had always been practical. So she named it gratitude. She named it respect. She named it the simple human relief of being treated well. And she kept her head down. Only now when she kept her head down, it was by choice. Not because she believed she deserved nothing better. Because she was afraid for the first time in a long time of wanting something she might lose. She had been at the ranch for 6 weeks when a stranger came to town. He arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara noted because Tuesdays were her days to go into Red Hollow for supplies, and she saw his horse tied outside the land office when she passed. A large glossy horse that did not belong to anyone in the valley. An expensive saddle. And through the land office window, the back of a broad-shouldered man in a coat that cost money, talking to the county land recorder with his hands moving. The way hands move when the speaker wants very much to control the direction of the conversation. She noticed it the way she noticed Henderson's shoulder. The way she noticed the flour bag beginning to tear. Not consciously at first, just a prickling at the edges of her attention. She bought the supplies. She drove back to the ranch. She mentioned it that evening to Caleb. "A stranger," she said. "At the land office. He was there a long time." Caleb looked up from the papers he was reviewing at the kitchen table. "Did you catch a name?" he asked. "No," she said. "But his horse had a brand I didn't recognize. 2 crossed lines over a circle. Not any brand I've seen in the county." He was quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" She described him. The expensive coat. The deliberate hands. The way he'd been standing planted unhurried with the particular ease of a man who knew exactly how the conversation was going to end before it began. Caleb set his papers down. Something had changed in his face. Not fear exactly, but a quality of attention that was different from his usual careful interest. More guarded. More inward. "I appreciate you mentioning it," he said, and his voice was measured in a way she hadn't heard before. She wanted to ask what it meant. She didn't ask. She went to bed that night with the same prickling at the edges of her attention, and she lay in the dark, listening to the wind against the walls of the house, and thinking about a stranger with deliberate hands and an unfamiliar brand, and about Caleb's face when she had described him. She thought, whatever this is, it is not finished. She thought, whatever this is, it is going to come for something he loves. She didn't know yet that it was going to come for everything. And she didn't know yet that the woman Red Hollow had decided was worth nothing was the only one who would be able to stop it. The stranger's name was Richard Hawthorne. She found that out 4 days later, not from Caleb, but from Mrs. Dunmore, who had a network of information that moved through Red Hollow faster than any newspaper. The old woman came in from town on Thursday morning with her basket and her arthritis and her sharp black eyes full of something that wasn't quite worry, but was close enough to its cousin to matter. "Hawthorne," she said, setting her basket on the kitchen table. "Land investor out of Denver. He's been asking questions about the Walker property for 3 days now." Clara kept her hands in the bread dough she was working. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that have answers attached to lawyers," Mrs. Dunmore said flatly. She began unpacking this basket with her swollen hands slower than she liked, and Clara knew better than to offer help she hadn't been asked for. "He had dinner at the hotel last night with Judge Pearson." Clara's hands slowed in the dough. Judge Pearson was not a man who had dinner with strangers for no reason. He was not a man who did anything for no reason. He was careful political and had been running the county's legal affairs for 15 years, with the kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly which conversations to have and exactly when to have them. "Does Caleb know?" she asked. "Caleb," Mrs. Dunmore said, with the particular tone she reserved for men being stubborn, "knows something is happening. Whether he's allowing himself to know how serious it is, that's a different question entirely." Clara pulled the dough, folded it, pressed it flat again. She thought about Caleb's face the night she'd described Hawthorne. That guarded quality. That inward stillness. She thought he knows exactly how serious it is. She thought he just hasn't told me. That bothered her more than she expected it to. She found him in the barn that evening. Not doing anything in particular, standing with his forearms resting on the top rail of the nearest stall, looking at one of the horses with the unseeing focus of a man whose eyes are pointed in one direction and his mind is pointed somewhere entirely different. Clara stopped a few feet away. "Mrs. Dunmore told me about Hawthorne," she said. No preamble. She had learned that preamble annoyed him, and she had learned she could read him well enough now to adjust. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was carefully arranged. "She talks too much," he said, but there was no heat in it. "She talks the right amount," Clara said. "What's he after?" A pause. A long one. "He's filed a claim," Caleb said. "Says the eastern section of this property, about 300 acres, was never legally transferred in the original land grant. Says there's a documentation error going back 30 years that invalidates my title to that portion." Clara absorbed that. Is there an error? He says there is. That's not what I asked. He looked at her with that slow gray gaze, and something moved through it. Something between frustration and unexpectedly relief. Like a man who had been waiting for someone to ask the direct question and hadn't been sure anyone would. My father bought this land fair, he said. Every deed, every transfer, every record, I've seen them. They're clean. Then where's the claim coming from? That's what I can't figure out. He turned back to the horse. The documents Hawthorne is presenting, I haven't seen them directly. My lawyer has. He says they look legitimate. Official seals, proper signatures, county filing dates. He stopped. But the dates don't line up with what I know. Clara was quiet for a moment. What do you mean they don't line up? The transfer date. Hawthorne is claiming March of 1861. My father was in Kansas City that entire month. He didn't set foot in Colorado until June. I have letters. I have receipts from a hotel. He wasn't here to sign anything. The barn was very still. Then someone signed for him, Clara said. Or someone manufactured a document that says he did, Caleb said. Which is a lot harder to prove when the county recorder's copies match Hawthorne's copies and mine are the only ones that look different. She stood with that for a long moment, the full weight of it. Your lawyer, she said. How much does he trust the process? Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. He trusts it the way a man trusts a bridge after he's already 2/3 of the way across. That's not enough, Clara said. No, he agreed. It's not. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her room with the lamp out and her eyes on the ceiling and her mind working. The way it worked, sometimes methodically, turning a problem over and over, looking at each surface. It was a habit she'd developed in the legal office where she'd worked at 18 filing papers for a lawyer named Beaumont, who'd paid her almost nothing, but had let her read everything she filed, which turned out to be worth considerably more. She'd spent 2 years reading contracts, land transfers, title deeds, affidavits. Not understanding all of it, not at first. But reading, absorbing, asking questions when Beaumont was in a patient mood, which he was approximately 40% of the time. She hadn't thought about any of that in years. She thought about it now. She thought document fraud leaves traces. Not always visible on the surface, but in the small things. The ink consistency, the letter formations, the bureaucratic language of one decade versus another. She thought if someone manufactured a document in 1861, they had to make it look like 1861. And unless they were extraordinarily careful, they made at least one mistake. She thought, I need to see those documents. She closed her eyes. Caleb told you to stay out of it. He didn't say that in words. But he didn't tell you about Hawthorne either, which amounts to the same thing. She thought about Mrs. Hatcher's flour spilling in the cold street. She thought about the crowd watching and doing nothing. She thought about the years of keeping her head down and what that had actually cost her. She thought not this time. She went to town the next morning on her regular supply run and made a small detour to the county records office. The clerk at the front desk was a young man named Tolliver, who was mildly flustered by the presence of a woman asking to see land transfer records, but not flustered enough to refuse particularly when Clara explained calmly and specifically exactly which documents she needed and cited the correct index year, which the clerk had not expected. You know the filing system? He asked, blatantly surprised. I worked in a legal office for 2 years, Clara said pleasantly. The Walker Grant, please. Transfer records, 1858 through 1865. She sat at the reading table for 2 hours. She went through every page carefully. And on the 47th page of the 1861 transfer record, she found it. It wasn't obvious. If you were moving quickly, if you were looking at the right things and not the wrong things, you would miss it completely. But Clara had spent 2 years reading documents drafted by the same county office, and she knew what the county recorder's standard phrasing looked like in 1861 because she had read dozens of documents from that exact period. The phrasing in the disputed transfer matched 1873, not 1861. A specific clause, a property boundary description clause, that hadn't been standardized in Colorado County records until after the Land Revision Act of 1869. Whoever had manufactured this document was good. but they had used a template that was 8 years too new. Her heart was hammering. She copied the relevant sections verbatim onto a piece of paper, noted the page and index numbers, thanked Tolliver, and walked out of the records office at the same measured pace she had walked in. She did not run. She was extremely proud of herself for not running. "I need you to look at something," she said to Caleb that evening. She put her copied notes on the kitchen table. He looked at them, and then he looked at her, and then he looked at the notes again. "How did you—" "I used to file records," she said. "I know what county language looked like in 1861. That clause right there wasn't standardized until after 1869. If your father signed that document in 1861, that clause wouldn't exist yet. Which means either the original document has been altered, or the copy in the county records was replaced entirely." He was very still. "Clara, I know it's not proof by itself," she said, moving faster now, "but it's a foundation. If your lawyer can get an independent document examiner to compare the ink composition and the paper combined with the anachronistic language combined with your father's hotel records from Kansas City." "Clara." His voice was quieter than she expected. It stopped her. She looked at him. His expression was complicated in a way she hadn't seen on him before. There was something almost raw, something underneath the usual careful steadiness. "You went to the records office," he said. "Yes." "I didn't ask you to." "I know. This could be dangerous. If Hawthorne has people in that office—" "He doesn't have Tolliver," she said. "Tolliver is 22 and easily confused. He didn't even know what I was looking for until I'd already found it." Caleb pressed his hand flat on the table over her notes like he was steadying himself. "You should have told me before you went," he said. "You should have told me about Hawthorne before I heard it from Mrs. Dunmore," she said back. The kitchen was very quiet. She met his gaze and did not look away, which was something she would not have done 8 weeks ago, and they both knew it. Finally, something shifted in his expression. Not defeat. Something more like recognition. "Fair," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "It is." The following week moved at 2 different speeds simultaneously. In the foreground, legal consultations, document reviews. The slow bureaucratic machinery of a formal challenge to Hawthorne's claim. Caleb's lawyer, a dry, methodical man named Aldrich, who wore the same brown coat to every meeting, became a near-daily presence at the ranch. Clara sat in on 2 of those meetings, not because anyone invited her, but because Caleb did not tell her not to, which she had learned to interpret as its own form of invitation. In the background, Red Hollow. She noticed it building the way pressure builds before a storm. The looks that were a fraction longer than they needed to be. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room and started again at a slightly different pitch when she left. She caught fragments, half-sentences loaded, pauses. The particular kind of silence that means something has just been said about you. On Wednesday, she heard it directly for the first time. She was at the dry goods counter when a woman she recognized, Martha Crane, wife of one of the town council members, stopped beside her and said without looking at her, at a volume calibrated for maximum audience reach, "It's remarkable what some women will do to secure their position. You'd almost admire the strategy if it weren't so transparent." Clara set down the tin she was holding. She turned and looked at Martha Crane. "I'm sorry," she said clearly with no drop in her voice. Martha finally looked at her surprised. Clara thought that she had responded at all. The old Clara wouldn't have. "I'm simply saying," Martha said, adjusting, "that some people find it convenient to make themselves useful at very specific moments." "Convenient," Clara said. "Like when someone is being defrauded and nobody in this town with the education and the resources to help is bothering to look closely enough to see it." Martha's mouth thinned. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Clara said. "I have read every relevant land record from 1858 to 1865. I have identified a specific drafting anachronism that places the disputed document's creation no earlier than 1869. I have provided this information to legal counsel." She picked the tin back up. "What have you done?" Martha Crane had no answer. Clara paid for her supplies and left. She made it almost all the way back to the wagon before her hands started shaking. Not from fear, she thought. From something that felt unfamiliarly like anger, that knew it was justified. She gripped the reins and breathed through it and let the wagon carry her back toward the ranch, and she thought, I am not invisible. I never was. They just needed not to see me. Caleb found out about the exchange with Martha Crane. Of course he did. Red Hollow was the kind of town where information traveled through walls. He came to find her that evening while she was in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't quite catalogued before. Something careful and warm at the same time, which was a combination she was still learning to read on him. Martha Crane is apparently under the impression that you demolished her in public, he said. I asked her a question she didn't have an answer to, Clara said. That's not demolishing someone, that's just a conversation. He almost laughed. The corner of his mouth moved, and she caught it before he controlled it. She's going to make things difficult, he said. She was already making things difficult, Clara said. She was just doing it at a volume I was pretending not to hear. He came into the kitchen fully and sat down at the table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee without asking another thing she'd started doing at some point without noticing when. Clara, he said. She set his cup in front of him and sat down across from him. I want to talk to you about something. Something in his tone made her still. Aldrich thinks the language evidence isn't going to be enough on its own, he said. He needs corroborating documentation. Something that places the original transfer record in a different state before the alteration. Your father's letters from Kansas City, she said. I have those. But Aldrich thinks Hawthorne will argue their personal records and challenge their verifiability. He needs something from an official source. He turned his cup in his hands. He thinks there may be a secondary record, a property survey filed with the territorial office in 1860 before the county took over record-keeping. If that survey exists, and the boundary descriptions match my deed, and contradict Hawthorne's claim, that's corroborating evidence from an entirely separate source. Where would that record be? Clara asked. The Territorial Archive in Denver. He looked at her steadily. Which means someone would need to go to Denver. The kitchen was quiet. Aldrich can go, she said, though she already knew that wasn't where this was heading. Aldrich has a case in Pueblo next week that he cannot reschedule. Caleb paused. And he also, and I'm quoting him directly here, said that whoever found the language discrepancy has better instincts in a records room than most trained clerks he's worked with, and that person should be the one to go. Clara looked at him. He was watching her carefully with that quality of attention that had stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling like being held up by something steady. You're asking me to go to Denver, she said. I'm asking if you're willing, he said. There's a difference. She thought about the train ride. She thought about a records archive in a city she'd never been to, looking for a document that may or may not exist. She thought about coming back empty-handed. She thought about coming back with something real. She thought 6 months ago I was crying over a flour bag. When would I leave? She said. Something settled in his face. Not relief exactly, something quieter than that. Thursday, he said. Then I'll need to reorganize the supply schedule before I go, she said. Mrs. Dunmore can't manage everything alone. I know, he said. I'll help her. She looked at him. You'll help with the household. I grew up in this house, he said with the particular mild dignity of a man who has just said something he considers obvious. I know where things are. Clara picked up her coffee cup. She was smiling at it, which she thought was probably visible, but she found she didn't care. All right, she said. Thursday. She found out what Hawthorne was really after 2 days before she left for Denver, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Not from Aldrich, not from the records office, but from one of Caleb's ranch hands. His name was Pete Greer, and he was a weathered man of 50 who had worked the Walker property for 11 years and who on Tuesday morning came to the kitchen door and asked to speak to Caleb in a voice that was quiet in the specific way that means something is wrong. Clara happened to be the one who answered the door. He's in the south pasture, she said. Pete looked at her, hesitated, then said, You're the one who's been helping with the legal business." "I found a document discrepancy," she said carefully. "That's all." Pete's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, "There was a man out by the eastern fence line yesterday, walking the perimeter, taking notes." Clara felt the familiar prickling. What kind of notes? The kind a man takes when he's measuring something. Pete looked at his boots. "I've seen that fence walked before, by a mining surveyor about 4 years back. There was talk then, just talk about mineral deposits under the eastern section. Copper maybe, or silver. Nobody confirmed it. The survey didn't go anywhere because Caleb wasn't interested in mining his own land." Clara was very still. "But Hawthorne would be," she said. "A man like that," Pete said quietly. "That's all he'd need to hear." She thought about 300 acres. She thought about copper or silver in the ground underneath. She thought about a land claim that appeared from nowhere, backed by documents that had never existed until someone needed them to exist. She thought this was never about a boundary dispute. This was about what's underneath the boundary. She thanked Pete, who nodded once and walked away, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment with her heart moving faster than usual. Then she went to find Caleb. She told him everything Pete had said, standing in the south pasture with the wind cold against her face, and his expression going through changes she catalogued carefully. Surprise, then a kind of grim recognition, then something that looked very much like controlled fury, held in with both hands. "A mineral claim," he said. "That's what this is. It would explain everything," she said. "He doesn't want the land, he wants what's under it. And if he can establish that the deed was always invalid, he gets the land, the minerals, and the legal precedent all at once." Caleb was quiet. "Pete should have told me about the surveyor years ago," he said, but without real heat. The anger was pointed somewhere else. "Pete probably thought it was nothing," Clara said. "It probably was nothing until someone with money and a lawyer decided to make it something." He looked at her. "Denver," he said. "I know," she said. "The territorial survey is even more important now. If we can show the original boundary was recorded at the territorial level before the county took over. Hawthorne can't claim the eastern section regardless of any county document. The territorial record would supersede it. And if the survey doesn't exist," he said, "then we find something that does," she said. "I'll find it." He looked at her for a moment with that clear, steady gaze. "You're very certain of yourself," he said. She thought about the woman on her knees in the street, 6 weeks ago, squeezing the torn edges of a flour bag together and believing she deserved to be there. "I'm learning to be," she said. Wednesday night, the night before she left for Denver, she was finishing her preparations in the kitchen when Caleb came in late. She heard his boots on the floor and didn't turn around, because by now she knew his footfall. The way you know a familiar sound in a familiar house. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you," she replied. He sat down at the table. She could feel his presence without looking, the particular stillness he carried that she had initially read as coldness, and had since come to understand was something else entirely. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to contain things carefully because he had run out of the luxury of letting them show. "My wife died," he said. Clara turned around slowly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at his hands folded flat against the wood. 4 years ago," he said. "Her name was Anna. She got sick in February, and she was gone by April." He paused. "I had been there was a problem with a neighboring property, a lawsuit. I thought I had time." He stopped. "I spent 2 weeks dealing with lawyers when I should have been with her. And when I got back, she was worse than I knew." The kitchen was very quiet. "After that," he said, "I stopped. I closed a lot of things. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was protecting myself." He finally looked up. "I think it was just grief wearing a practical hat." Clara didn't say anything for the moment. She didn't reach for a comfort she hadn't been asked to give. But she sat down across from him, and she put her hands on the table, and she stayed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Not unkindly, simply. He met her eyes. "Because," he said, "I'm not willing to make the same mistake twice. and I think you deserve to know why I intend to." He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "I'm not good at this part." "I know," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, contained face of a man dismantling a wall he'd built with his own hands, one stone at a time. "I'll be back from Denver in 5 days," she said. "I know. And then we'll deal with Hawthorne," she said. "Together." He held her gaze. "Together," he agreed. She stood up. She picked up the lamp. She walked to the doorway and paused. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "She knew," Clara said quietly. "Whatever time you missed, she knew the rest of it. People who are loved always know." She didn't wait for his response. She carried the lamp up the stairs and went to her room, and she lay in the dark with her hands pressed flat against her own chest, feeling her heart move steadily in it, and thought about a man who had grieved himself into silence, and a woman who had survived herself into invisibility, and wondered carefully with both hands around the wondering what might grow in the space between those two broken things. She was on the first train east before sunrise, and in her coat pocket, folded small, were every note she had made and every question she hadn't yet answered. She was going to find what Hawthorne didn't want found. She was absolutely certain of it. The train moved east through the dark, and Clara sat upright in her seat with her notes in her lap and her mind already 3 steps ahead of where her body was. She had never been to Denver. She had never been anywhere, if she was being precise about it. Red Hollow was the only world she had ever known. Its small cruelties, its narrow streets, its people who had long ago decided what she was and saw no reason to revise that opinion. And now she was on a train moving through the pre-dawn Colorado dark, with a coat pocket full of handwritten notes and the name of a territorial archive she had never visited, looking for a document that might not exist to save a piece of land belonging to a man who had told her about his dead wife the night before in a quiet kitchen. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold window glass. She thought, "Don't think about this kitchen. Think about the survey." She thought about the survey. The Territorial Land Office in Denver had been established in 1858 and had operated independently of county records until 1867, when Colorado's accelerating population had pushed the administrative burden down to county level. Any survey or transfer record filed between 1858 and 1867 would exist in both systems, the original at the territorial level, the copy at the county. Which meant, if someone had altered the county copy of the Walker transfer record, the territorial original would still reflect what the document had actually said before anyone touched it, if it still existed. Territorial records from the 1860s were not always preserved with care. Fire, flood, bureaucratic indifference. Any of those could have reduced the relevant pages to nothing. She was operating on the assumption that the document existed because the alternative was to give Hawthorne exactly what he wanted, and she had made her decision about Hawthorne on a Wednesday night, sitting across from Caleb Walker in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was enough. Denver arrived in the gray mid-morning, all noise and scale, and the particular electricity of a city that believed in itself. Clara stepped off the train with her bag over one arm and her notes in her pocket, and moved through the station with the focused efficiency of someone who could not afford to be distracted by being impressed. She found the Territorial Archive in 40 minutes by asking 3 people, which was 40 minutes faster than she'd budgeted for, and she took that as a good sign. The archivist was a heavy-set man named Clough, who looked at her over the top of his spectacles with an expression that said he was calculating whether she was going to be difficult. Clara set her notes on his counter, named the specific filing index she needed, cited the year range, and gave him the property boundary identifiers from Caleb's deed. Clough's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've done this before," he said. "I've read enough to know what I need," she said. He brought her 3 boxes. She worked for 4 hours. She found the survey on the second page of the 3rd box, and she almost missed it because it was filed under a slightly different boundary designation than she expected. The original survey used a different notation for the eastern property line, an older territorial convention that had been standardized differently at the county level. She almost passed it. She turned the page, felt something pull her attention back, turned the page again. And there it was. The 1860 Territorial Survey of the Walker Land Grant, filed and sealed with the original county recorder's mark and a territorial commissioner's signature across the bottom. The eastern boundary was described in precise dated detail, and the boundary described matched Caleb's deed exactly and contradicted Hawthorne's claim entirely. The document was clean. The ink was consistent throughout. The language was unmistakably 1860, no anachronisms, no modern phrasing tucked into the wrong decade. And in the lower margin, added by hand in a different ink, but dated the same year, was a notation she hadn't expected. Survey conducted in the presence of Jacob Walker, property owner. March 14, 1860. Caleb's father. Standing on his own land. 2 full months before the date of the fraudulent county document. Alive and present and recorded. Clara set the page down. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed. Then she signaled for Clough. "I need a certified copy of this document," she said. "And I need the certification witnessed and sealed today." Clough looked at the survey. His eyebrows rose again higher this time. "That's a significant finding," he said carefully. "Yes," Clara said. "It is. How quickly can you have it ready?" He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating his initial assessment. 2 hours, he said. "I'll wait," she said. She was back on a westbound train before sunset. She sat with the certified copy in her bag nested in a leather document folder Clough had provided, which she thought was a good sign about how seriously he'd taken the find, and she let herself feel for approximately 12 minutes the full relief of it. The tight wire she'd been walking since she'd first heard Hawthorne's name went slack inside her chest, and she leaned back against the seat and breathed and thought, "We have him." Then she thought about the county records office. She thought about Tolliver, the 22-year-old clerk, who'd shown her the records without hesitation. She thought about the fact that if Hawthorne had someone inside the county system, someone who had replaced the original document with a forgery, that person knew the records had been searched. Tolliver was young and easy to read. If Hawthorne's associate had asked him who'd been looking at the Walker files, he would have said Clara Whitmore's name without understanding why it mattered, which meant Hawthorne might already know what she'd found. Which meant the time between arriving back in Red Hollow and getting that certified copy into Aldrich's hands was the most dangerous window. She sat up straighter. She thought, 5 more hours on this train. I can't make it go faster. Think about what I can control. She thought about Caleb. She thought about telling him what she'd found, and the way his face would move, that contained careful face, when he understood that his father's name was in the margin of that survey. Standing on his land. Recorded. She pressed her hand against the outside of her bag, feeling the shape of the document folder through the leather. She told herself she was thinking about the case. She was mostly thinking about Caleb. She arrived back in Red Hollow on Sunday evening, 2 days earlier than planned, and found the situation had moved without her. Pete Greer was at the station. That was the first thing that told her something was wrong. Pete had no reason to be at the station on a Sunday evening, unless he'd been sent, and Caleb didn't send people without a reason. "What happened?" she said before he could speak. Pete took her bag. Hawthorne moved faster than expected. He filed a formal injunction Friday morning court order to suspend any transfer or modification of the eastern section pending resolution of his claim. Judge Pearson signed it. Clara was already moving toward the wagon. "Where's Caleb?" "At the ranch. Aldrich is with him. They've been going back and forth since Friday." "Is the injunction enforceable as filed?" Pete glanced at her. "Aldrich says it's got procedural problems, but nothing that'll kill it before the hearing." "When's the hearing?" "Tuesday." Clara stopped walking for half a step. Then she kept moving. Tuesday was 48 hours away. "Drive fast," she said, climbing into the wagon. Pete drove fast. The kitchen at Walker Ranch, at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, had the particular atmosphere of a room where difficult things had been said for several hours, and nobody had eaten anything. Aldrich sat at the table with papers spread in front of him that he was staring at without reading. Mrs. Dunmore was at the counter, moving with deliberate purpose, assembling, something refusing to be passive. Caleb stood by the window, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize as him, keeping a very specific feeling on a very short leash. He heard her come in. He turned around. Something moved through his face, relief she thought, and then he caught it and steadied himself, but she had seen it. "You're early," he said. "I found what we needed," she said. The room went still. She reached into her bag and produced the leather document folder. She set it on the table in front of Aldrich. 1760, Territorial Survey, she said. Original filing certified copy sealed and witnessed. Eastern boundary described in full matching Caleb's deed contradicting Hawthorne's claim. And in the margin, she opened the folder and pointed Jacob Walker's name, March 14, 1860, 2 months before the date on Hawthorne's document. Aldrich picked up the copy with both hands. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change. Lawyers' expressions rarely do, but something happened in the quality of his stillness. "This is a territorial commissioner's seal," he said. "Yes." "This predates county jurisdiction." "Yes." "This is a superseding record." "Yes," Clara said. "I know." Aldrich set the document down carefully. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with the measured tone of a man who gives compliments the way some people give money reluctantly, and only when they are absolutely warranted, "this is a very significant find." "I know," she said. Mrs. Dunmore from the counter said, "Someone feed this woman." Caleb found her outside later, after Aldrich had left with the certified copy locked in his own document case, and a list of actions to take before Tuesday morning. Mrs. Dunmore had actually fed her warm food and strong coffee, and now Clara was standing in the cold air because she needed the cold, needed something that asked nothing of her except to breathe. She heard him come out. "Your father's name is in the margin," she said without turning around. "I saw. I was standing on his land in March of 1860. It's recorded, official. Nobody can take that away." A pause. "Clara." His voice was rough at the edges in a way she hadn't heard before. I don't know how to." "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." She turned around. I was closer than she expected, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before. Not the careful steadiness, not the guarded containment. Something underneath all of that, something that had been there the whole time, and that he was no longer making any particular effort to keep out of view. "You went to Denver for me," he said. "I went for the ranch," she said. "Clara." She looked at him. "I went for you," she said quietly. "Both things can be true." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any production, simply took it the way you take hold of something you've decided you're not willing to lose. His hand was warm and rough and absolutely certain. She did not pull away. She said, "Tuesday 1st. He almost smiled. That almost smile she had been cataloging since the first week, the one that reached the corner of his mouth and stopped just short of the rest of his face. "Tuesday 1st, he agreed. They stood in the cold for a while, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most comfortable silence she had felt in 25 years. Monday was the worst day. Not because anything broke. Because everything almost broke, and the difference between those two things is made of nerve and stubbornness, and the willingness to hold on when every reasonable instinct says to let go. It started in the morning when Aldrich arrived with news that Hawthorne's lawyer, a man from Denver named Prescott, who apparently had a reputation that preceded him into every room, had filed a motion to exclude the territorial survey on the grounds that the certification process had not followed the correct protocol. "Can he do that?" Clara asked. "He's trying to," Aldrich said. "The certification was completed by the archivist of record," she said. "I watched him do it. I have the witness log." Aldrich paused. "You have the witness log." She reached into her bag and produced the receipt Clough had given her, a standard archival witness record signed and dated. Aldrich took it, read it. "You anticipated this," he said slowly. "I anticipated that someone would try to exclude it," she said. "So I made sure everything was done correctly, and I kept every record." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. "I learned to anticipate problems," she said, because I've spent my whole life being on the wrong end of them." He nodded once slowly. Then he went to work on the response filing. But the day wasn't finished. At 2 in the afternoon, Pete came in with the news that Hawthorne had been seen at the county recorder's office that morning before it opened, talking to someone through the back entrance. "Tolliver?" Clara asked. "No," Pete said. "Someone else. Older man. Stocky. Nobody could get close enough to hear." Clara looked at Caleb. He looked at her. "They're trying to clean up the record," she said. "Can they? If they remove or alter the county copy before the hearing, our territorial document is still valid," she said. "But it becomes the only evidence of what the original said. And Hawthorne's lawyer will argue the territorial copy is the irregularity, not the county one. Can he make that argument credibly?" "With the right judge," she said quietly. They both thought about Judge Pearson. "I need to get to the county records office before it closes today," Clara said. Caleb was already reaching for his coat. "Then we're going together," he said. They arrived at the county records office at 3:30. Tolliver was at the front desk and he looked up when they came in, and then looked immediately away, which told Clara everything she needed to know about the morning. "Mr. Tolliver," she said, keeping her voice even. "Miss Whitmore." He was not meeting her eyes. "I need to see the Walker Land Grant records," she said. "The same index I reviewed last week." Those are—" He stopped. Started again. "Those records are currently in review." "In review by whom?" Silence. "By whom, Mr. Tolliver?" He was 22 years old and not built for this. She could see it working through him, the discomfort of being caught between what he'd been told to do and the direct, unwavering attention of a woman who clearly already knew the answer to the question she was asking. "Mr. Hawthorne's legal representative submitted a review request this morning," he said. "Standard procedure." "Standard procedure," Caleb said from beside Clara, and his voice was very quiet and very level in the way it got when he was most serious. "Those are my family's records." "I understand that, Mr. Walker, but—" "What time did the review request come in?" Clara asked. 8:15. "The office doesn't open until 9, Clara said. Tolliver's face went through several things at once. "Mr. Tolliver," she said with something that was not unkind, but allowed absolutely no room for evasion. "You are 22 years old, and you are about to make a decision that will define your professional life. I need you to think carefully about that." The room was very still. "I need you to tell me if those records were accessed before the office opened this morning," she said. "And I need you to understand that whatever answer you give me, I will find the truth through other means. The only question is whether you're on the right side of it when that happens." Tolliver looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "I wasn't here," he said. "I came in at 9. When I arrived, the records box for the Walker grant was already out on the reading table." Clara looked at him steadily. "And did you check the contents?" A long pause. "The index page," he said quietly. "I noticed the county transfer record for 1861 was missing. The sleeve was there. The document wasn't." Caleb's jaw set hard. Clara felt something crystallize inside her, cold and clear as winter water. They had removed the document. The county copy of the fraudulent transfer record was gone. Which meant, when Tuesday's hearing came, Hawthorne's lawyer would argue that no county record existed to compare against, and the territorial survey would stand alone, unsupported by any local corroboration. It was smart. She was almost only for a half-second impressed. Then she thought you took the wrong document, because the document they'd removed was their own forgery. They'd panicked when they realized the territorial survey existed, and they'd pulled the fraudulent copy out of the county record to prevent direct comparison. But in doing so, they'd created a gap in the record, a conspicuous documentable gap, an empty sleeve where a transfer record should be, which was, if anything, more damning than the anachronistic document would have been. "I need a written statement from you," Clara said to Tolliver. "Dated today, describing exactly what you found when you arrived this morning. The records box on the table, the empty sleeve, the missing document. Will you do that?" Tolliver looked at her. "If I do that," he said, "I'm going to be in the middle of this. "You're already in the middle of it," Clara said. Not unkindly. "The only question is which side of the middle." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached for a blank page. They left the records office with Tolliver's signed statement at 4:15. Outside, Caleb stopped walking. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "When Tolliver said the document was missing, you knew what it meant immediately." "When someone removes their own evidence," Clara said, "it usually means they've realized it's become a liability." She paused. Hawthorne panicked. He didn't expect the territorial record to exist. When he found out we had it, he tried to eliminate the comparison point. But the comparison point was his own forgery, and now there's a hole in the county record where it used to be, and we have a clerk's testimony that the hole appeared after an unauthorized early morning access. Caleb stared at her. "That's better evidence than the document," he said slowly. "It's better for our case, yes," she said. "A forged document proves the forgery. A missing document plus unauthorized access proves intent to conceal. A court cares about both, but it reacts differently to each." He was looking at her with that full attention gaze that she had stopped finding uncomfortable. "Clara," he said. "Tuesday," she said. "Say whatever you're going to say on Wednesday." "I've been saying things in my head for 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been listening to them." He looked at her for a moment. Then the almost smile arrived, fuller this time, closer to a real one than she had seen before. "Tuesday," he agreed. Monday night. She couldn't sleep again, but for different reasons than before. She lay with the ceiling above her and the ranch quiet around her, and thought about tomorrow. About Prescott and his courtroom reputation. About Judge Pearson, who had signed Hawthorne's injunction without visible hesitation. About a room full of Red Hollow residents who had spent 25 years deciding what Clara Whitmore was worth and who would be watching when she walked into that courtroom. She thought about Eleanor Whitfield and her crowd. She thought about Martha Crane and her calibrated voice. She thought about all the rooms she had entered with her head down, all the words she had absorbed without answering, all the space she had compressed herself into because she believed that was the only space she was allowed. She thought, tomorrow, they're going to try to take something that belongs to someone I care about, and they're going to try to make it look legal, and they're going to look at me the way they always look at me. She sat up. She thought, let them look. She got out of bed. She went to the small writing table in her room. She sat down, and by lamplight she went through every document, every note, every piece of evidence she had assembled, and she organized it one final time. Clean, logical, sequential, so that Aldrich would have exactly what he needed in exactly the order he needed it. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally went back to bed, she slept without difficulty, the deep, useful sleep of a person who has done everything that can be done and understands that the rest belongs to tomorrow. And tomorrow was coming, whether she was ready or not, so she was going to be ready. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. She dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, not to perform anything, but because she understood she had always understood, even when she'd had almost nothing, that the way you present yourself is the first argument you make before you ever open your mouth. She wore her best dress, which was clean and well-fitted, and showed evidence of careful repair, her own repair done, neatly, invisibly, the way she did everything. She put her hair up properly. She checked her document case one final time. When she came downstairs, Caleb was already in the kitchen. He was dressed as she had never seen him. Not in work clothes, but in a dark suit that fit him with the particular fit of something made for the person wearing it. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. "Save it for Wednesday." He almost laughed. "Right." Mrs. Dunmore appeared from the hallway, assessed them both with her bright black eyes, and said, "Good. You both look like people who are going to win something." She pointed at the coffee. "Drink first." They drank first, and then they went to face Richard Hawthorne in a courtroom that had never once in its history seen a woman like Clara Whitmore walk into it and demand to be taken seriously. She walked in with her head up. She did not lower her eyes, and in the front row of the gallery, Eleanor Whitfield sat with her careful, composed expression and watched, and for the first time since Clara had known her, seemed genuinely uncertain what she was watching. Hawthorne stood on the other side of the room. He looked at Clara the way powerful men look at things they've already dismissed. He had no idea what was in her document case. He was about to find out. The courtroom was already full when they arrived. That surprised her. Not the people she had expected people. Red Hollow was a town that ran on other people's business, and a land dispute involving Caleb Walker was the kind of event that drew a crowd the way a fire draws heat. What surprised her was the quality of the attention in the room. It wasn't the comfortable, entertained attention of people watching something that didn't concern them. It was tight, watchful. The attention of a town that understood on some collective animal level that what happened in this room was going to matter. Clara walked in beside Caleb and did not look at the gallery. She kept her eyes forward, her document case against her side, and she moved to the seat Aldrich had held for them with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided once and for all that this room belongs to her as much as it belongs to anyone else. She felt the eyes anyway. She felt Eleanor Whitfield's eyes, specifically a particular quality of attention she had been recognizing since that morning in the street, the morning that felt like a different lifetime now. Across the aisle, Hawthorne sat with Prescott beside him. Prescott was exactly what his reputation suggested. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of face that had been arranged over decades into an expression of permanent, mild authority. He radiated the confidence of a man who had never once walked into a courtroom uncertain of the outcome. He glanced at Clara once briefly and looked away. That single glance told her everything she needed to know about how he'd been briefed on the opposition. She was the housekeeper, a woman of no consequence attached to the defendant by circumstance and possibly by something less respectable. She was not in Prescott's calculation a factor. She opened her document case and laid her materials out in the order she and Aldrich had established the night before, and she thought good. Let him think that. Judge Pearson called the session to order at 9 o'clock sharp. How was a compact, gray-haired man with a permanent expression of careful neutrality that Clara had been studying since she'd learned his name. He had signed Hawthorne's injunction without visible hesitation, which could mean he was in Hawthorne's pocket, or it could mean the injunction had been procedurally sound enough that refusing it would have been the irregular choice. She didn't know which yet. She intended to find out in the next few hours. Prescott opened. How was very good. She gave him that without hesitation. He was controlled, precise, and he built his argument the way a skilled carpenter builds a staircase, each step supporting the next, the whole structure leading inevitably to the conclusion he wanted the judge to reach. The Walker land grant had been established on the basis of a transfer record that contained a fundamental error in the original conveyance. The error was not cosmetic. It went to the root of title. Under Colorado territorial law, a defective conveyance in the original chain of title invalidated all subsequent claims, regardless of the good faith of the current holder. Howe was careful not to use the word fraud. He was careful not to suggest anyone had done anything wrong. He was simply presenting in his measured, silver-haired way the objective legal reality of a paperwork problem that unfortunately required a remedy. The remedy being 300 acres of Walker land, transferred to Hawthorne's holding company. Clara watched the judge as Prescott spoke. Pearson was taking notes. His expression didn't change. But twice she saw his pen slow slightly, not stopping, just slowing at specific points in Prescott's argument. She noted which points. When Prescott finished, Aldrich stood. Aldrich was not a dramatic man. He did not have Prescott's silver authority or his architectural elegance. What he had was precision and an absolute refusal to waste a single word. And on this particular Tuesday morning, he had something better than either of those things. He had Clara's documents. "Your Honor," he said. The plaintiff's argument rests entirely on a single county record, a transfer document dated March 1861. We have 3 specific and independent objections to the validity of that document, each of which is supported by physical evidence we are prepared to enter today. Pearson looked up from his notes. "Proceed," he said. Aldrich looked at Clara. She handed him the first document. The anachronistic language was the first argument. Aldrich presented it methodically, the specific clause, the date of its standardization, the documentary evidence that the phrasing could not have existed in 1861. He had brought in a written opinion from a legal language expert in Colorado Springs, who had examined Clara's notes and confirmed the finding independently. Prescott objected. The objection was smooth and technically competent. The judge overruled it. Clara noted the overruling with something that felt like the first deep breath she'd taken since arriving. The second argument was Tolliver's statement. The unauthorized early morning access. The empty sleeve where the county copy of the transfer record had been. The chain of custody broken the record, missing the timing suspiciously aligned with Hawthorne's awareness that the opposing case had strengthened. The room shifted when Aldrich read Tolliver's statement aloud. It was subtle. Just a change in the quality of the silence. The way silence has texture when something unexpected lands inside it. Clara heard it. She kept her eyes on the judge. Pearson had stopped writing. He was listening with his full attention now, and his expression had changed in a way that was small but unmistakable. The careful neutrality was still there, but something underneath it had moved. He was recalculating. Prescott's objection this time was sharper with an edge in it that hadn't been there before. He challenged the admissibility of Tolliver's statement, challenged the characterization of the records, access as unauthorized, challenged the relevance of a missing document to the validity of the claim. Aldrich looked at Clara. She handed him the second document. "Your Honor," Aldrich said. "The plaintiff argues that the missing county record is irrelevant because the claim can stand on its own merits. We would like to introduce a document that makes the plaintiff's removal of that county record considerably more significant than he suggests." He placed the certified territorial survey on the bench. The room went very quiet. Prescott was on his feet before Aldrich finished speaking. His objection was immediate, fully formed, and utterly without the composed authority of his earlier manner. He was moving faster than he wanted to, and Clara could see it, and she thought, there it is. There's the man underneath the silver hair. The certification process for this document did not follow correct archival protocol, Prescott said. The copy is procedurally invalid and should be excluded. On the contrary, Aldrich said, and looked at Clara one more time. She produced Clough's witness log, the archival receipt, the signed certification record with the date, the time, the archivist's credentials, and the territorial commissioner's verification number that she had specifically requested and specifically documented because she had anticipated this exact objection while sitting on a train moving through the Colorado dark. She handed it to Aldrich. He placed it before the judge without a word. Pearson examined it for a long time. The room waited. "The certification appears to be in order," Pearson said. He looked at Prescott over his spectacles. "Objection overruled." Something happened in Prescott's expression that his training could not entirely suppress. It was brief, a flicker, a tightening around the eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed mask, but too slowly. Too late. Clara had seen it. She looked at Hawthorne for the first time since the session began. He was watching her. Not with dismissal now. Not with the mild contempt of a man who has already discounted an obstacle. He was watching her with the focused, recalibrating attention of someone who has just understood that they have been badly, significantly wrong about something. She met his gaze and did not look away. The recess came at 11. Aldrich walked with Clara to the side of the room and spoke in a low, direct voice. "The territorial survey is holding," he said. "Pearson is taking it seriously. The witness log killed Prescott's exclusion motion. But Prescott is going to try something else in the second session. He's going to try to establish that the territorial survey has a chain of custody problem on our end. He'll argue that you specifically had access to the document long enough to potentially alter it before certification." Clara stared at him. "He's going to accuse me of forging the evidence. He's going to suggest the possibility," Aldrich said. "He won't say it directly. He'll frame it as a question of independent verification. He'll ask who you are, what your qualifications are, why the defendant sent an unqualified housekeeper to a territorial archive rather than a trained legal professional." She absorbed that. "And what's the answer to that question?" she said. The answer, Aldrich said, is that Clough can be deposed. The archive has its own witness record. But Prescott knows we can't produce Clough today, and he knows that creating doubt in the judge's mind before the evidence is fully weighed is worth more right now than the actual truth of the matter. He's going to make the hearing about me, she said. Yes. She looked across the room at Hawthorne, who was in close consultation with Prescott, both of them speaking quietly and rapidly. Then let him, she said. Aldrich looked at her carefully. Clara. I mean it, she said. Let him make it about me, because everything he says about me is going to be in that courtroom record, and everything in that record can be answered. She looked back at Aldrich. I have spent 25 years letting people define me in rooms I wasn't allowed to speak in, she said. Today I'm allowed to speak. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, a single precise nod, the kind he gave when he had decided something. All right, he said. Then when he comes at you, don't defend. Respond. There's a difference. I know, she said. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. He had been across the room speaking to Pete, and now he looked between them with eyes that were asking a question his face wasn't quite forming. What did I miss? He said. Prescott's second session strategy, Clara said. Which is, me, she said simply. Caleb's jaw set. Then, it's all right, she said. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just briefly, just a touch, and felt him steady under it. I can handle being the subject. I've had practice. He looked at her with everything he hadn't said yet written plainly in his face. I know you can, he said. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what? I'm worried, he said quietly, about what it costs you. Every time. She looked at him. She thought this man. This careful, contained, impossible man. Today it costs me nothing, she said. Today I'm spending it on something that matters. The second session began at 1 in the afternoon. Prescott stood up and redirected exactly as Aldrich had predicted, and he was careful, very careful, but not careful enough to fully conceal the desperation underneath the craft. He questioned the integrity of the discovery process. He noted with courteous skepticism that the key evidence in the defendant's case had been located and retrieved by a woman with no legal training, no professional credential, and no formal connection to the case beyond her employment in the defendant's household. He suggested delicately with his silver-haired precision that the chain of custody between the archive and the courtroom passed through hands that the court had no independent means of evaluating. I didn't use her name. He referred to her as the individual the defendant sent. He spoke about her the way people in Red Hollow had always spoken about her, as a thing to be evaluated, a function to be questioned, not a person to be addressed. And then he made the mistake. Your Honor, Prescott said with a rueful, reasonable tone that had clearly worked in many courtrooms before this one. The court should ask itself why the defendant, facing a serious legal challenge, chose to entrust the retrieval of critical evidence to someone with no qualifications. One is compelled to wonder whether the selection of this particular individual was motivated less by competence than by, he paused just a fraction too long, other considerations. The room reacted, not loudly. But the quality of the silence changed sharply, the way temperature changes when a window opens. Clara felt it. She felt Caleb go rigid beside her. She put her hand on the table between them, not touching him, just present, and she felt him hold. Judge Pearson looked at Prescott with an expression that was for the first time all morning not neutral. Counsel, he said with a flatness that had teeth in it, you will confine your remarks to the evidence. Prescott recalibrated immediately. Of course, Your Honor. My point is simply one of procedural reliability. Your point has been noted, Pearson said. Move on. Clara looked at the judge. He had not looked at her, but the intervention had been immediate and unambiguous, and it told her something about Judge Pearson that she hadn't been certain of until this moment. He was not Hawthorne's. Howe was careful and political, and he had signed an injunction. She disagreed with, but he was not Hawthorne's man. He was a judge, and whatever else that meant in Red Hollow, Colorado, in 1883. In this room today, it meant something. She breathed. And then she heard Aldrich say, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call a witness." She had not expected that. She looked at Aldrich sharply. He did not look at her. "The defense calls Miss Clara Whitmore," Aldrich said. She stood up. She had not prepared for this. Aldrich had not told her. She understood immediately why, because if he had told her, she would have prepared, and preparation would have made her careful. And careful was not what this moment needed. She walked to the witness position. The room was very still. She was aware of every person in that gallery. She was aware of Eleanor Whitfield in the front row, and Martha Crane 3 rows back, and Pete Greer near the door, and Mrs. Dunmore. Mrs. Dunmore had come. She hadn't known that, sitting with her swollen hands folded in her lap and her bright black eyes absolutely fixed on Clara, with something in them that was not worry. It was faith. Clara stood straight. Aldrich asked her to describe her background. She did briefly, directly, without apology. 2 years in a legal office. Filing records, reading documents, learning the indexing systems of 2 different courts. She named the lawyers she had worked for, named the cases she had filed, named the specific skills she had developed. She was aware of the room listening. She was aware that some of them were hearing this for the first time, that the woman they had known as a cleaning woman, and a mending woman, and an invisible woman, had spent 2 years learning the language of legal records, and had simply never had an occasion to use it where they could see. Aldrich asked her to describe the discovery process in Denver. She described it, the archive search, the methodology, the specific feature that had drawn her attention, the notation in the margin. Jacob Walker's name. March 14, 1860. She described the certification process. She described requesting the witness log specifically. She described why. "Why did you request documentation of the certification process?" Aldrich asked. "Because," Clara said, "I anticipated someone would try to challenge it." "Why did you anticipate that?" "Because the people who manufactured the fraudulent county document knew that a superseding territorial record would destroy their claim," she said. "And I knew that if they understood we had found the territorial record, they would look for every available mechanism to exclude it. The most obvious mechanism was procedural challenge, so I made sure every procedure was documented." Prescott objected. Pearson overruled it. "And when you returned to Red Hollow," Aldrich continued, "what did you find had happened to the county records in your absence?" She described Tolliver's discovery, the missing document, the empty sleeve, the timing. "And in your assessment," Aldrich said, "what does the removal of that county document indicate?" "It indicates," Clara said clearly, "that the people who placed that document in the county record understood that it could not withstand direct comparison to the territorial original. And rather than allow that comparison to occur in this courtroom, they removed their own evidence. Which is not what you do with a genuine document. It is exactly what you do with a forgery." The room reacted. This time it was audible. Pearson called for order and the room settled, but the temperature had changed irrevocably. Then Prescott stood for cross-examination. He came at her directly now, with no more pretense of courteous skepticism. He challenged her account of the archive visit. He challenged her characterization of the language anachronism. He suggested that her identification of the problematic clause was the result of misreading or bias, and he said this with a smile that did not reach anything behind it, a woman's unfamiliarity with the technical precision required by actual legal analysis. Clara waited for him to finish. Then she said, "The clause in question is the 1869 Boundary Description Standardization. The language reads," and she quoted it verbatim from memory without looking at her notes. "And that specific phrasing does not appear in any Colorado county land record before 1870. I can name 11 documents from the period between 1858 and 1868 that handle the same boundary description using the pre-standardization language. I can cite the specific territorial circular that authorized the new phrasing. I can tell you the name of the commissioner who issued it and the date of its distribution to county offices." She paused. "Would that be helpful?" Prescott looked at her. The courtroom was completely silent. "No further questions," he said. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. Caleb said nothing. He simply put his hand over hers on the table briefly, firmly, and then removed it before anyone who was watching could make too much of it. She felt it anyway. She felt it in a way that had nothing to do with the courtroom or the hearing or the 300 acres of Walker land or any of it. She filed it away under Wednesday. Aldrich's closing was clean and surgical. He presented the 3 lines of evidence as a unified argument: the anachronistic language, the missing county record, the superseding territorial survey. And he drew the conclusion. Simply, the plaintiff's claim was built on a document that did not exist in 1861, that had been removed from public records when it became a liability, and that was directly contradicted by an independently preserved territorial record that predated any county involvement. He sat down. Prescott's closing was confident on the surface and hollow underneath, and the room could feel it, which meant the judge could feel it. He had lost the chain of custody argument. He had lost the cross-examination. He had lost specifically the moment when a woman with no formal credentials had quoted territorial legal history from memory and offered to cite 11 supporting documents. He had lost when he'd looked at her and said no further questions. Pearson called a 2-hour recess for deliberation. Clara sat in the hall outside the courtroom with Caleb on one side and Mrs. Dunmore on the other, and she felt the 2 hours. The way you feel time when you've done everything you can, and the only thing left is to wait. "You were extraordinary," Mrs. Dunmore said, with the directness she applied to everything. "I was prepared," Clara said. "That's what extraordinary usually is," the old woman replied. Caleb didn't say anything. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he was looking at the floor, and she knew he wasn't seeing the floor. "It's going to be all right," she said. He looked up. "I know," he said. "I've known since you walked back from Denver on that train." He paused. "I'm not thinking about the hearing." "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Wednesday," he said. She felt heat in her face, which she attributed to the warm hallway, and said nothing, and sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and the document case at her feet, and the sound of Red Hollow moving around them outside. Pearson came back in 1 hour and 40 minutes. He settled behind the bench. He looked at his notes once, then he looked up. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he said. "The plaintiff's claim rests on a single county transfer record. The defendant has presented 3 independent lines of evidence calling the validity of that record into question linguistic analysis, consistent with a post-1969 drafting date testimony of irregular records access, resulting in the document's disappearance, and a superseding territorial survey predating county jurisdiction that directly contradicts the plaintiff's boundary claim." He paused. "The territorial survey carries superior authority under Colorado law. Its certification has been properly documented, and its chain of custody is unimpeached. The absence of the county record combined with the evidence of unauthorized records access creates a substantial inference that the county document was not an original, but a subsequent alteration." The room was absolutely still. "The court finds that the plaintiff has failed to establish a valid basis for his claim," Pearson said. "The injunction is dissolved. The plaintiff's land claim is dismissed. The Walker land grant stands as recorded." And then it came the sound of a room that has been holding its breath for 3 hours, releasing it all at once. Clara heard it as though from a slight distance. She heard Aldrich say something beside her. She heard Pete Greer in the back of the room make a sound she'd never heard from him before. She heard Mrs. Dunmore say something short and sharp and satisfied. And she felt Caleb's hand close around hers under the table. Not briefly this time, not with the careful restraint of a public place. Firmly. Fully. The hand of a man who has made a decision. She held on. She let herself hold on. Across the room, Hawthorne stood with a face like the surface of still cold water. No expression, nothing readable. He had the self-possession of a man who had lost before and knew how to absorb it, and she gave him that. He would leave Red Hollow and find another piece of land and another weak point in another record, and he would try again somewhere else, because men like Hawthorne didn't stop. But he would not stop here. He would not stop here because of her. Prescott was already packing his briefcase. He didn't look at her. And then it happened. The thing she hadn't expected. The thing that landed harder than the verdict, harder than the judge's words, harder than anything that had happened in that courtroom all day. Eleanor Whitfield stood up from the front row of the gallery. She was looking at Clara. And Eleanor Whitfield, who had stood on a boardwalk above a woman on her knees in the dirt and spoken loud enough for the whole street to hear, said nothing. She pressed her lips together once, and then she gave a single deliberate nod. Not an apology. It would never be an apology. Clara understood that, but it was an acknowledgement, the first one she had ever given. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she turned away, because Eleanor Whitfield's acknowledgement in the end was not what today had been about. It was a footnote, a data point, a small piece of evidence that the world could, under sufficient pressure, revise itself. What today had been about was standing in a room that had never made space for her and making space for herself. What today had been about was 300 acres of Walker land and a man's father's name written in a margin in March of 1860. What today had been about was a woman who had spent 25 years keeping her head down, finally lifting it all the way up in front of everyone who had ever told her she shouldn't. And not one of them had been able to stop her. Caleb was still holding her hand. She thought Tuesday is almost over. She thought Wednesday is very close now. And for the first time in her life, she let herself look forward to something without immediately looking for the reason it would be taken from her. She simply looked forward. Wednesday came the way she had always known it would, quietly without ceremony, with the particular stillness of a morning that understands it is carrying something important and has the good sense not to announce it. Clara was in the kitchen before anyone else. That was habit. That was muscle memory built across months of early mornings at Walker Ranch, of learning the rhythms of a house until they became her own rhythms. She made coffee the way she had made it every morning, strong 2 pots, because Caleb drank more than he ever admitted to anyone. She put bread on. She stood at the counter with her hands wrapped around her own cup and felt the quiet of the house around her like something physical, like warmth. She had not slept badly. That surprised her given everything. But the body, she had learned, knows when a fight is over. And last night, her body had known, and she had slept the deep earned sleep of someone who had nothing left to brace for. She heard his boots on the stairs. She did not turn around. She poured his coffee and set it where he always sat, and she heard him stop in the kitchen doorway for a moment, just a moment, and then she heard him cross to the table and sit down. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday," she confirmed. She turned around. He was looking at her with everything he'd been holding since Tuesday, and possibly since considerably before Tuesday, and none of it was contained anymore. He had stopped containing it. She could see the decision in his face, the deliberate, fully conscious decision of a man who has put down a wall he carried for a very long time and does not intend to pick it back up. "I need to say something," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been working out how to say it for about 3 weeks." "I know that too." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "You're not going to make this easier, are you?" "I could," she said. "But you should say it yourself. You'll want to have said it yourself." He looked at her steadily. Then he said, "I have been in this house for 4 years since Anna died, and I have not let one single thing matter to me in a way I couldn't control. Not the ranch, not the people, not anything." He paused. "And then you picked up a basket of spilled groceries and didn't make a sound about it, and I couldn't not see it. I couldn't not see you." Clara set her coffee cup down. "You reminded me," he said, "what it looks like when a person has something real inside them. Not performance, not strategy, just real." His jaw moved. "I don't want you to be my housekeeper, Clara. I want you to be—" He stopped. "I want you to be here, as yourself, beside me, for as long as you're willing." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. She thought about a girl of 14 who lost her mother and learned to compress herself into spaces that didn't hurt. She thought about a girl of 16 who buried her father and learned that the world did not stop or slow or make accommodations for grief. She thought about 10 years of keeping her head down, her mouth shut, her presence small enough to be tolerated. She thought about a flour bag splitting open in a cold street and a crowd that watched and did nothing. She thought about a man kneeling in the dirt beside her without being asked. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I will reorganize your supply system every 6 months because I will always find a more efficient way to do it. I will not pretend to agree with you when I don't. I will not make myself smaller to make you more comfortable." "I know," he said. "I have nothing," she said. "No property, no family name, no money of my own beyond what you've paid me. I know. The town has been wrong about you since the day you arrived in it," he said. "The town can keep its opinions." She looked at him. She thought he means it. Every word. He has never said a word he didn't mean. "Then yes," she said, simply, fully. "Yes." He stood up from the table. He crossed to her. He took both her hands in his, and she felt the warmth of them, the familiar roughness, the absolute certainty in the way he held on. "I should have said it 3 weeks ago," he said. "You said it when you were ready," she told him. "That's when it counts." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had catalogued but never quite seen completed. The almost smile arrived all the way, without stopping, a real and full and unguarded smile that changed the entire landscape of his face. She thought she might catalogue it forever. Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the scene in approximately 1 second, and said, "Finally," before retreating back down the hall, with the dignified satisfaction of a woman whose patience has been vindicated. Clara laughed. It was the same real laugh that had surprised her weeks ago in this kitchen, the one that had come from somewhere she'd almost forgotten. Only this time, it was bigger. This time, it had room to be bigger. Red Hollow did not change overnight. She had not expected it to. She understood towns understood that they move at the pace of their own discomfort. That collective opinion shifts the way river courses shift slowly, under sustained pressure, and that the people most invested in the old story take the longest to let go of it. But things moved. In the week after the hearing, 3 women came to Clara, separately, privately, at moments they had clearly chosen for their privacy. Not the prominent women. Not Eleanor Whitfield or Martha Crane. The other women, the ones who existed in the town, the way Clara had always existed, doing their work without recognition, navigating the space that was given to them, rather than the space they deserved. The first was a woman named Ruth Sadler, who washed laundry for 4 families and had been doing it since her husband died 6 years ago. She came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon and stood at the kitchen door with her hands twisted together and said, "I heard what you did, in Denver, and in the courthouse." She stopped, started again. "I just wanted to say I heard it." Clara brought her inside and gave her coffee, and they talked for 2 hours, and Ruth left looking different than when she came in, and Clara couldn't explain exactly why, but she thought it had something to do with being heard back. The second was a girl of 17 named Josie Carr, whose family had fallen into difficult circumstances and who had begun taking in mending Clara's kind of work, the invisible work, the work that kept families together without anyone acknowledging it. Josie came in with her head down and her shoulders in the compressed posture Clara recognized with a physical jolt, the posture of someone who has already started believing what people say about her. Clara sat her down. She talked to her for 3 hours. She told her things nobody had ever told Clara, that capability was not accidental, that her skills had real value, that being poor did not make her invisible, and being invisible did not make her less. She told her about legal offices and land records and territorial archives, and the specific satisfaction of knowing something useful and using it at the exact right moment. She told her, "You can learn anything. The only requirement is that you decide to." Josie left with 2 books from Clara's small collection, a list of things to read and practice, and her shoulders 1.5 inches higher than when she'd arrived. Clara watched her go and felt something settle inside her. Not resolution exactly, more like a direction clarifying. A sense of what came next that had been forming at the edges of her thinking for weeks and had just in this moment moved to the center. She brought it to Caleb that evening. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. Their table, it had become their table, without either of them formally establishing it, and she laid it out the way she laid out everything. Directly. In order. With the reasoning visible. "I want to open a workshop," she said. For women who need skills and can't pay for formal education, not charity actual learning. Reading basic accounting, legal literacy, practical household management, mending and repair taken seriously as trade skills rather than invisible labor. She paused. I want to give women what I never had, someone who believed they were capable of more than survival. Caleb listened with his full attention. Where? He said. There's an empty building on the north side of town, she said. The old assayer's office. The owner is willing to rent it at a low rate. I've already asked. He looked at her. You've already asked. I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, she said. I didn't want to bring it to you until it was a real proposal, not just an idea. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? Not should you be doing this. Not is this practical. Not what will people say. What do you need from me? She looked at him. 6 months of operating costs while it finds its footing. After that, it carries itself. Done, he said. That's a lot of money, Caleb. Less than 300 acres of Walker land, he said. Which I still have because of you. She opened her mouth. Don't argue with me about this, he said. You won't win. She closed her mouth. She thought about arguing anyway because she always had opinions, and then she thought about the fact that she had just been offered exactly what she needed, and the dignified response was to accept it. All right, she said. Good, he said. She gathered her notes. She was halfway to standing when he said her name. She looked at him. I'm proud of you, he said. Not dramatically. Just said it the way he said everything, like it was simply true and therefore needed to be said. She stood there for a moment with the words settling into her. 25 years. 25 years of a world that had decided her worth, assigned it a number near zero, and maintained that position with the consistent certainty of people who have never been required to revise their opinion. 25 years of absorbing those assessments, and despite everything never quite fully believing them, holding on to some small resistant part of herself that refused to surrender the argument. Thank you, she said. It was a small thing, but it was not a small thing. The workshop opened on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks later, and Clara had not chosen Tuesday by accident. 12 women came on the first day. Some she had spoken to. Some had heard from others. Some arrived with the uncertain, careful energy of people who are used to being turned away and have learned to expect it. She met every one of them at the door. She shook every hand. She said every name out loud, and clearly, because she understood what it meant to have your name spoken by someone who was looking at you when they said it. She had arranged the space simply. No pretension, no performance. A room where learning happened, where questions were permitted, where capability was assumed rather than earned through proof. She stood at the front on that first morning and looked at 12 women who had spent their lives being told who they were by people who had no right to decide it. She said, "You are here because you deserve to be here, not because I gave you permission, not because circumstances gave you a break, because you showed up, and showing up is already the hardest part. Everything else is just information, and information is something we can learn." One of the women in the back, she was 53, deeply weathered with a face that had absorbed a lifetime of hard weather, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but somewhere in the complicated space between them. Clara looked at her. I know, she said simply. I know. Martha Crane came to the workshop on the third week. Clara saw her from across the room and felt the familiar tightening old reflex, old armor clicking into place. But she held still and waited to see what Martha intended. Martha stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, looking at the room. At the women bent over writing exercises, at the woman in the corner, learning to read a basic contract at Josie Carr, explaining a mending technique to 2 older women who were listening with the focused attention of people who have just discovered that someone is taking them seriously. Martha looked at Clara. I heard what you said in the courtroom, she said. Not quietly, clearly, at a volume that meant she wasn't hiding it. Clara waited. About spending years letting people decide what you were capable of, Martha said. I've been thinking about that sentence for 3 weeks. Clara said, and Martha's expression moved through something complicated. And I said something to you in a store that I wouldn't have wanted said to me. She paused. Her jaw was set the way jaw sets when someone is doing something they find difficult and has decided to do it anyway. I don't find this easy. I know, Clara said. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Martha said. I don't think I've earned that. No, Clara said. You haven't. Martha absorbed that. She nodded once. Fair. But, Clara said, if you want to be useful, there are women in this room who know how to read a budget better than they know how to read a legal document. And you know something about town council procedure that I don't. Martha looked at her with an expression Clara couldn't entirely classify. You want me to teach a class, she said. I want you to contribute something real, Clara said, which is different from being forgiven. People can do real things before they've been forgiven. Sometimes that's how they get there. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, What time? Thursdays, Clara said. 1 o'clock. Martha nodded. She did not say thank you. Neither did Clara. They looked at each other with the clear-eyed recognition of two women who had been opponents and were considering the possibility of something else, and that was enough for today. Hawthorne came back 3 months later. Not to Red Hollow, he was smarter than that. But word reached them through Aldrich that he had filed a similar claim against a smaller property. 2 counties north, using a different variation of the same methodology. Different county, different document, different victim, with no Clara Whitmore to find the flaw. Clara heard it on a Thursday evening and went still. She sat with it for a long time. Then she went to Caleb. Aldrich needs to contact the legal office in that county, she said. And the Territorial Archive in Denver needs to flag Hawthorne's pattern in its cross-reference index. And there's a woman named Tolliver the clerk from our county records office who should write a formal report of what happened here, so there's a documented precedent. Caleb looked at her. You've been planning this since you heard, he said. I've been thinking since I heard, she said. That's different. And if he files somewhere else after that, then we document that too, she said. And the one after that, until there's enough documented pattern that any judge in Colorado knows his name and his method before he walks into a courtroom. That could take years, Caleb said. Yes, she said. He looked at her steadily. You're willing to spend years on this. Someone has to be, she said, and I know what to look for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, All right. She looked at him. Just all right. You've never been wrong about what you were willing to do, he said. I've learned to trust that. She felt something warm move through her chest that she no longer had any interest in pretending was anything other than what it was. I've been right about most things, she said. Most, he agreed. Name one exception. You thought you were worthless, he said simply. That was wrong. She had no answer for that. She didn't try to find one. She just stood in the kitchen of the house that had become home with the man who had knelt in the dirt beside her when nobody else would move, and let the truth of it settle into all the places it hadn't yet reached. They married in April. Not a large ceremony. Clara had no interest in performance, and Caleb had even less. It was a simple affair. Aldrich as witness, Mrs. Dunmore with her swollen hands clasped and her eyes bright. Pete Greer cleaned up and serious in the back of the small room, and a selection of women from the workshop who had asked and been told yes. The judge who performed the ceremony was not Pearson. It was a younger man named Holt, who had come to Red Hollow 6 months ago, and who had attended one of Clara's legal literacy sessions, with the expressed intention of understanding what people in his jurisdiction needed to know and didn't. He had shaken her hand afterward and said she was doing important work, and she had thanked him without deflecting it, which was still something she was learning. Clara wore a dress she had made herself. Of course she had. It was well fitted and carefully finished and showed no evidence of the 2 weeks of work it had taken to produce, because she had always been precise about things that mattered. Caleb looked at her when she walked in and said quietly and privately, so only she could hear, "You're the most capable person I've ever met." She said, "That's a very unusual thing to say at a wedding." "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it works." A year passed. Then 2. Red Hollow kept moving the way towns do, with its small frictions, and its recalibrations, and its slow grinding revision of ideas. It had held too long. The workshop grew. 12 women became 20, then 30. Clara hired Josie Carr as her assistant, which Josie received with a composure that Clara recognized as the performance of composure, hiding something that felt like disbelief, which Clara recognized even more deeply. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't mean something," Clara told her. "I'm not pretending," Josie said. "You're holding very still in a way that means you're afraid if you move it'll go away." Josie looked at her with wide eyes. "How did you know that?" "Because I did it for 25 years, Clara said. "You can put it down. It's real." She watched Josie put it down. She watched the stillness soften into something else. She thought this is the work. Eleanor Whitfield never came to the workshop. Clara did not expect her to. But 6 months after it opened, Eleanor donated a significant amount of money to its operating fund through a third party in a way that was clearly designed to be untraceable if Clara wanted to pretend she didn't know who it came from. Clara knew who it came from. She deposited the money and said nothing publicly because she understood that some people move toward the right thing slowly and sideways and in the dark, and that was still movement, and movement still counted. Martha Crane taught Thursdays at 1 o'clock for 2 years and became, to Clara's genuine surprise, one of the most effective instructors in the program. She was direct, knowledgeable, and had no patience for women who underestimated themselves, which turned out to be a quality that translated remarkably well into teaching. They were not friends, not exactly, but they had become something more useful than that. They had become people who respected what the other could do and built on it rather than around it. Hawthorne was brought before a territorial judge 14 months after the hearing in Red Hollow on the strength of a documented pattern of fraudulent land claims that Aldrich and Clara had spent 11 months assembling. The evidence was comprehensive, sequenced, and devastating. The judge called it one of the most methodically documented cases of systematic fraud he had seen in 20 years on the bench. Hawthorne was convicted. He lost everything he had acquired through fraudulent means, including several properties that were returned to their original owners. Clara heard the verdict from Aldrich, who came to the workshop to deliver it personally. She set down what she was doing, heard him out, said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing. Aldrich watched her for a moment. "That's all," he said. "What would you like me to do?" she said. "It was always going to end that way. It just took time to get there." He shook his head slightly. Then he said, "You know, when Caleb first mentioned you to me, he said he'd hired someone who was more capable than anyone in Red Hollow had noticed." She looked up. "He said that before the Denver trip," she said. "He said it the week he hired you," Aldrich said. She turned that over. "The week he hired you. Before Denver. Before the hearing. Before any of it. Before she had done anything in front of anyone to prove what she was capable of. He had simply seen it. The same way he had seen it in the street when she was on her knees in the dirt, and the crowd was watching, and he had knelt beside her, because something in her, something real and resistant and undefeated, had been visible to him when it was invisible to everyone else. She thought about 25 years of believing she was what the world said she was. She thought about a single Tuesday morning in November, when a pair of work boots stopped beside her in the mud. She thought that's where it started. Not with the hearing, not with Denver, not with the workshop. That's where it started. With a man who looked at a woman everyone had decided was worth nothing and thought, no. That's wrong. I can see that's wrong. She stood in the workshop with 12 women learning around her, and Aldrich waiting for her response, and the sound of Red Hollow moving outside, and she thought some things begin with one person willing to look clearly. She thought some things end with the person who was looked at finally looking at herself the same way. That evening she walked back to Walker Ranch under a sky that had gone the particular deep blue of Colorado twilight, the color that has no equivalent anywhere else, and she walked through the front door and found Caleb in the kitchen, which was still their kitchen, would always be their kitchen, reading with his reading glasses on, and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, because he always forgot to drink it when he was absorbed in something. She stood in the doorway. He looked up over the glasses. "How was today?" he said. She thought about Ruth Sadler, who had come back this week for the third time, and was reading her first legal document with the focused determination of a woman who has decided she is not finished. She thought about Josie Carr, standing at the front of a room, holding herself like she belonged there. She thought about Martha Crane arguing a point about property law with a woman 20 years her senior, and both of them completely absorbed in the argument. She thought about Aldrich's voice saying the week he hired you. She thought about a man with work boots kneeling in the mud without being asked. Good, she said. She came inside and closed the door behind her and sat across from him and reached over and picked up his cold coffee cup and handed it to him without a word, because she had been doing that for 2 years, and she would do it for 20 more, because some small, precise acts of care accumulate into something that holds a life together. He took the cup. He looked at her over the glasses with that fully arrived smile she had catalogued on a Wednesday morning and never stopped cataloging. And Clara Whitmore, who had been told for 25 years that she was worth nothing, who had survived on borrowed space and invisible labor, and the stubborn refusal of some resistant part of herself to fully believe the verdict sat in her own kitchen, in her own life, beside the man who had been the first to look at her clearly and felt the complete, settled, unassailable weight of knowing exactly who she was. She had always been this person. She had simply needed one honest witness to prove it. And once she had been seen, truly nothing in Red Hollow, not its cruelty, not its small opinions, not its long memory, not its powerful men, or its watchful crowds, had been able to make her small again. She was done being small. She had always been done. She had just finally arrived at the day she believed it,